If you are new to Classic Who or have been watching it for a while, you may have several questions about the way it looks. Why does it look sort of low definition compared to modern television? Why does the quality and even the frame rate sometimes change when the characters go outside? And why is the quality of some of the earlier stuff, particularly from Jon Pertwee's era, somewhat inconsistent? Well, wonder no longer. Over this video, I will go over the different formats that classic Doctor Who was shot and broadcast on, as well as the various efforts that have been made to restore the hit television series as close to its original quality as possible. Some of this information is a bit technically involved, but I will do my best to keep it to the very basics. Well, no point in beating around the bush, let's get into it. The first question we will delve into will concern the somewhat low definition appearance of the classic run. The key factor in the quality of the image of Classic Who is that it was in general shot and finished on standard definition videotape rather than celluloid film. Unlike film, which can be scanned and rescanned to high-definition digital video, the definition of videotape is limited by the number of lines in the signal. When in black and white, Doctor Who was shot on 405-line videotape. On this system, 376 lines were used for video information, and the rest for metadata. A similar principle applies to videotape. This was 625-line tape with 576 lines for image information. The best way to imagine this is to imagine each line having the height of 1 pixel on digital video. The black and white video would be 376 pixels high, and the color video would be 576 pixels high. This method of video storage can obviously only give you so much detail, but it was a great deal cheaper to shoot Doctor Who on videotape than it was to shoot it all on film. For this reason, it was the go-to to produce the show on. For the first 20 years, the show was shot and edited on 2-inch quadruplex videotape, which was the standard for BBC. Then from season 21 onwards, it was subbed out for 1-inch videotape, which produced a slightly better image. However, not everything for the show was shot on videotape. It was generally impractical to bring the video cameras Doctor Who was shot on onto location, so most location work for the show ended up being shot on film. For the first 6 years, 35mm film was favoured, but eventually they settled to shoot it all on 16mm film. As the show was generally edited on videotape, this film footage would then have to be converted over to tape, usually by pointing a video camera at a screen running the film footage. This accounts for why the quality of the show often changes depending on whether it's in the studio or on location. If it's on location, in general, you're watching a video recording of a film reel, which has then been bounced onto another videotape to integrate it into the rest of the show. This process introduces what is called generational quality loss, leading to the location footage often having less detail than the studio footage, despite being shot on a higher quality format. There are some exceptions to this general rule. Starting with season 23, everything was shot on videotape by default, meaning that celluloid film was phased out of the Doctor Who production entirely. And even before that, not all of the location work for Doctor Who was shot on film. On a couple of occasions, they made use of BBC outside broadcast fans to shoot location work on videotape. This can be seen on serials like Robot or The Seeds of Doom. These serials, as a result, have a more consistent quality to them, having all been shot on the same format. There are also a handful of episodes in the black and white era that were finished, edited, and broadcast on 35mm film, despite largely being shot on videotape. This includes, of all things, The Space Pirates Episode 2, which was filmed entirely on 35mm film. Moreover, on occasion, the 16mm location film trims still exist in the archives, as opposed to only existing in the video scans made for editing. In these cases, the Doctor Who restoration team, who will feature heavily later in this video, are able to do completely new scans of the film material and insert them into their episodes. The result is that the full quality of the film can be brought out, making them now more detailed than the studio material. This can be seen apparently on several serials from the 19th season and on the season 7 premiere Spearhead from Space, which exists entirely on 16mm film as it was entirely shot on location. This accounts nicely for the difference in quality of the studio and location work, But what about the frame rate? To understand this, we need to understand the difference between progressive and interlaced formats. Celluloid film is a progressive format, which means you are showing each frame of the film progressively, one right after the other. The British television standard was to shoot film at 25 frames per second, so all the location work shot on film appears at 25 frames per second. Videotape, however, is an interlaced format. Let's take the 625 line videotape, for example, with the 576 lines of image information. Instead of displaying frames 576 lines high consecutively, the image is broken up into fields, each consisting of 288 alternating lines. For example, first you would get all the odd-numbered fields for 1/50th of a second, then the even-numbered ones. When displayed on an old CRT TV, this gives the illusion of getting 50 full frames per second. This works perfectly on older TVs, but modern TV technology doesn't recognize interlaced formats natively. If you've ever watched a video that has this sort of combing effect going on, that's because it's interlaced. Your screen is mashing two video fields together because it doesn't know any better. To get around this, most modern Blu-ray players come with de-interlacing algorithms, which use clever trickery to create 50 full progressive frames per second out of the interlaced fields. The upshot of all this technical nonsense is that all the film work is presented at 25 frames per second, but all the videotape stuff will appear to run at 50 frames per second just by virtue of format. This is a pretty solid basic background for the look of the show, but unfortunately, it's not as simple as all that. The next thing we have to take into account is the restoration of the missing episodes. As noted earlier, save for the small number of serials finished on film, all of Doctor Who was held in the archive on their 2-inch videotape broadcast masters, or 1-inch after season 23. Unfortunately, the BBC did not have infinite storage space or endless cash to buy new videotape, so for a time it was common practice to wipe videotape masters for reuse. Unfortunately, this would be the fate of a lot of the first 11 seasons of Doctor Who. In fact, of the 381 episodes broadcast in the first 11 years of the show's history, only 76 exist in their original broadcast format, and only 7 of those in the black and white era. The first serial to exist entirely in its broadcast format is Spearhead from Space, which is retained entirely in its 16mm format. Every single black and white serial that was broadcast from videotape had their tape wiped, and to date, 97 episodes from those first 6 years remain entirely missing. So what about the not missing ones? We'll begin with the black and white era because the restoration of those episodes is fairly easy. The 7 episodes that exist in their broadcast format were the ones I mentioned earlier that were finished onto 35mm film rather than tape. The rest of the black and white episodes in the archive are retained as 16mm film tele-recordings. These are copies that were generally made to ship to other countries for broadcast, which were made by pointing a 16mm film camera at a screen displaying the videotape master. By and large, these tele-recordings are of pretty solid quality, save for some warping caused by the principle of pointing a camera at a screen. For DVD and Blu-ray releases, the black and white episodes are easy to restore. Clean the film tele-recordings, scan them, and go. Well, not quite. As they are film recordings, they run at 25 frames per second rather than the 50 fields per second of the broadcast tape. This is fine for any location work that may be on the show, that was 25 frames per second anyway, but it means that all the studio work has been mixed down from 50 fields per second to 25 frames per second. The solution? VidFire. The VidFire process is pretty simple. First, the 16mm film is thoroughly cleaned and scanned to digital video. Then, the studio portions of any given episode are imported into the VidFire program. This program then creates intermediate frames between the scanned frames, doubling the number of the frames in the video. These frames are then broken up into interlaced fields, thereby reconstructing as best as possible the original look of the studio videotape. The result is that, once again, all the location work is at 25 frames per second, and the studio work is 50 fields per second, just as it was in the broadcast. Easy. But what about the missing color episodes? Unfortunately, the restoration of the color episodes is a lot more involved. The key reason is that the color episodes are retained in the archive in two different formats. The first format, much like the black and white episodes, is that of a 16mm telerecording. These were also done in black and white for compatibility reasons. Not everyone around the world switched to colour television at the same time as England, so black and white copies were better suited for most international distribution. The second format is that of NTSC colour videotape. Because the world refuses to be nice and simple, analog videotape had various formats. The 625 line 50 field per second videotape I explained earlier is the PAL format, which was used by Britain, Australia, and many others. However, North America used the NTSC format. This system also operated on the idea of interlaced fields of video information, but used different specs. The fields in NTSC video were displayed at 60 fields per second, and the tape consisted of 525 lines, 480 of which were used for image information. By the analogy we used earlier, this roughly equates to a 480 pixel high image. Due to this compatibility issue, any Doctor Who going over to North America had to be converted from PAL to NTSC, which in general meant a loss of quality as they were going from 576 lines of information to 480. It is in this NTSC format that a lot of coloured Doctor Who episodes were returned to England, which left the Doctor Who restoration team with a bit of a compatibility problem. So, with the black and white film recordings and the NTSC colour tapes, how were missing Doctor Who episodes restored to as close to their original format as humanly possible? With extreme difficulty. The first instinct with the NTSC videotapes was to simply just convert them back to PAL, do the process that converted them from PAL to NTSC in the first place, but the other way around. This, however, raised some problems. The downmixing of 60 fields per second to 50 produced juddery movement, and the loss of quality caused by the original conversion from 576 lines to 480 was exacerbated. The resulting images were not really commercially viable. So engineers at the BBC went back to the original machine that converted the PAL tapes to NTSC in the first place and took it apart, eventually finding a way to reverse the original PAL to NTSC conversion rather than just converting it back to PAL. How does this work? I can't pretend to understand that. It seems like borderline wizardry to me. But the upshot is, it worked well enough to produce video generally free from judder and with better quality than the double converted videos. This process was turned to several Doctor Who serials to prepare them for DVD release, including Inferno, episodes 2 and 3 of The Claws of Axos, Colony in Space, The Curse of Peladon, episodes 1 to 3 of The Sea Devils, episodes 1 to 2 of The Mutants, and The Time Monster. This works perfectly well for serials that had been returned in NTSC format, but a lot were only retained officially on the black and white 16mm telerecordings. So what was to be done there? To understand this method of colour recovery, we're going to need to understand how analog video works, more specifically, the idea of chroma and luma. In short, the luma of an analog video was how bright any given part of the screen is. On its own, this component appears like a black and white image. The chroma contains all of the color information. On playback, the chroma and luma are laid on top of each other, giving the full color image. When the black and white telerecordings were made of the original PAL color tapes, the chroma signal was still retained in the form of visual noise that we will refer to here on in as chroma dots.
And the pattern of dots, the sort of weave pattern in the dots, give you the hue, and the intensity of the dots gives you the saturation.
It is therefore possible with the right technology to scan these chroma dots and extrapolate from them the chroma signal of the original videotape. This is in fact what the Doctor Who restoration team has done when possible. Use the chroma dots on the black and white film to map the original colours of the episodes, adjusted any colours that might have come out wrong in the process, laid them on top of the black and white film image, then use the vidfire process to return the whole episode to its original field rate. This rather clever method has been applied to Doctor Who, generally with pretty good results. This process was turned to episodes 2 to 7 of The Ambassadors of Death, episodes 2 to 6 of The Mind of Evil, episode 3 of Planet of the Daleks, and episode 1 of Invasion of the Dinosaurs. However, In the case of episode 1 of The Mind of Evil, there were no chroma dots to recover from the black and white print, as they had been filtered out when the print was made. So what to do? This process is pretty much what it says on the can. Going in yourself and recoloring the black and white material by hand. A cursory scroll on YouTube will tell you this is something of a hobby people have. There have been some beautiful colorizations of episodes originally broadcast in black and white done by some very talented individuals, such as I'm Pretty Sure That's Chroma, which is an infinitely funny channel name.
I'm fairly sure that's Chroma.
For episode 1 of The Mind of Evil, the same principle was applied. Stuart Humphreys, also known on YouTube as Babel Color, was brought in to recolor the episode from scratch using the Chroma Dot colored episodes from the same serial as reference material. The resulting work is magnificent and deserves the praise it has gotten and then some. There is, however, one more method by which color is restored to old episodes of Doctor Who, by using multiple sources at once. Remember that brief explanation of Luma and Chroma I gave while explaining Chroma Dot Recovery? Well, that process is the center of this final color restoration process, the method that the Doctor Who restoration team seems to have decided to rely on from here on in. The first step, as with the black and white serials, is to run a scan of the black and white telerecordings through vidfire to restore the frame rate of all the sections shot on videotape. This resulting video is then used as the Luma for the final product. The Chroma is then sourced from a completely different source. For some serials, this other source is an off-air recording of the serial. Several colour serials of Doctor Who were returned to the BBC archive in the form of videotapes recorded by viewers from home. In these situations, the chroma from these tapes is placed on top of the vid-fired black and white film scan, reconstructing the colour image rather well. This process was used for Doctor Who and the Silurians, Terror of the Autons, and the Demons. It was also initially used for the Ambassadors of Death, but the home recordings of that serial were plagued with colour distortion, so it was only possible to partially restore the colour to those episodes until the Chroma Dot recovery process was ushered in. For other serials, the chroma source was the broadcast NTSC tape made for TV distribution in North America. As mentioned earlier, the reverse standards conversion used to bring the NTSC tapes back to their original PAL format yielded pretty decent video quality, but it was reasoned that an even better image could be derived if they only used the chroma from these converted tapes and pasted those onto the vid-fired black and white telerecordings. The result is a much sharper image than the one yielded only by the RSC process, and several serials have been reissued with this brand new restoration. Inferno received a special edition DVD release with this process, and the Blu-ray releases of all the serials that have been previously RSC processed are presented with this new hybrid restoration. The original RSC only restoration also being packaged as an optional extra. However, for all the fantastic work that has been done by the Doctor Who restoration team, it is impossible for these episodes to be restored to the full quality of their original PAL master videotapes. The hybrid film scan RSC color method provides by far the best image possible, but there is still an inconsistency in quality to be seen. However, it is still damn impressive work that it manages to look this good, so I do not want to be accused of knocking the Doctor Who restoration team. They're wizards, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, that is as quick an explanation I can give for the various quirks in how classic Doctor Who looks. I hope you found this video informative and that you'll like and subscribe. Is it still considered good form to ask that? Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you have a good day.